As we sit here, we talk about the connect, and we think, we're on the bleeding edge. People before us came and thought they were on the bleeding edge, and they were, as they were trying to devise new ways of seeing and understanding the world, new kinds of experiences that approached the concept of immersion or of augmentation or of seeing the world in new ways or of depth in otherwise flat images. I won't say much more. I'd like to basically hand it off to Erkki, who's going to basically school us in what's come before, so we can better understand what could come next. Thank you.
Okay. So, thank you, Golan, and I must say that I'm a big fan of Golan's work, and I also find it extremely interesting that this event has taken place. I'm not going to give you any proto-Kinect demonstrations, but I will talk about a few things that I hope that could link and connect with some of those things that you're trying to develop, and surely there are things you have seen before, hopefully a few things that you have never heard about, or at least never thought about. So Golan gave, I think, a truly perfect introduction to the topic, so I don't have to say anything about that anymore. So instead, let me introduce you Marion Shroud, an art history student from Chestnut Hill who once visited the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So this is Marion in the late 1960s, peeking at a work that was new at the time and since became very famous. And it's still kind of controversial, so this is the time to close your eyes. I'll tell you when you're allowed to open them again. So, behind this door, this is what Marion saw. It is not a stereoscopic 3D image, rather it is what we often call a diorama in 3D, which is enclosed to this kind of a set which the artist never wanted to be seen, except by the museum staff that was installing the piece after his death. So this is a piece he secretly worked on for 20 years in a hidden studio in New York, which was supposed to be revealed for the world after his passing. And the work, as you already saw, titled Étant donné, given, two parts, l'asciutto and the gas et d'éclairage, water for and the illuminating gas. And so this work, which is too dense to be talked about in detail in this presentation, was presented in a diagrammatic way by Lyotard in an exhibition he put together many years ago, showing basically the structure, the doors on the right, the dividing wall, and then a carefully calculated perspectival representation that you already saw in a visual 2D version. Something that obviously plays with ideas from the past. We could go all the way back to the Renaissance time and these drawing machines that Albrecht Dürer and many others devised for translating something in 3D to a 2D surface. But this is maybe not quite the thing that was happening here. We could also think about the pornographic imagination, and I forgot to ask you to close your eyes a second time. These ladies imagined to be placed in these boxes that happened already in the 18th century. I don't know if it really happened anywhere else but in imagination until the 20th century. But something that Marcel Duchamp would have been aware of. And then there were surrealist pieces like this particular photograph by Hans Bellmer, La Poupée from 1938 that sort of like in certain ways anticipated the pose. But so if this talk is about stereoscopic 3D and a certain kind of media archaeological explorations of that, so why did I show you this piece that evokes 3D in certain ways but definitely is not? And the answer to that question is something that you cannot really see here, but if you take the train to Philadelphia and go and see this piece in the side room of their world famous Marcel Duchamp exhibit, you will find out that in this door there are two little holes that are illuminated and that guide you, that actually tell you that there may be something behind, hidden behind this wooden door. And they are the two holes on the top, close to the center of the door. And I would bet that these holes actually evoke the idea about binocular vision. So they evoke the idea of the stereoscope without actually, in the strict sense, being one. Why do I think so? I think so because for Marcel Duchamp, whom I probably think that he is the most important artist of the 20th century. Because in Marcel Duchamp's long work, during his career, stereoscopy is constantly present. From this early, pretty interesting piece called Handmade Stereoptical Slide, Hand Stereoscopy, that he put together while he was staying in Buenos Aires during the First World War, which is a so-called rectified, ready-made, all the way to the very last piece that he realized, which was actually after already submitting the piece we saw, Etat Donné, to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, waiting for his death to be constructed and revealed for the world. This was the very last work, which is very modest piece called Anaglyphic Chimney, which is basically an anaglyphic stereographic drawing. This is a collection of those materials he used just before his death to put together that stereoscopic drawing, supposed to be seen through those anaglyphic glasses. So, we have one example of artists' interest in stereoscopic 3D here. And I think that if we think about stereoscopic 3D in general, so we often think about something like in these pictures. So it leads to this big and kind of cliche question, so where is the fascination? And why is it such a fad that seems to be coming back over and over again? Some people say it actually happens in 20-year cycles. So what we've seen recently sort of like maybe repeat something that we experienced in the virtual reality craze around 1990, and then around 60s and 70s there were some things like, wow, 3D movies and stuff like that, and then we go back all the way to 1950 and that famous 3D movie craze after the Second World War. Surely it has something to do with this fascination of breaking through the screen, reaching reality and representation. This is something that we could talk about forever. It is about this kind of like a dream of making invisible, so intangible things tangible, and this idea of haptic gaze. You may know that within the so like visual theories, the haptic gaze goes back, all the discussion of the haptic gaze goes back to the late 19th century, which basically means theorizing about certain kind of tangible, tactile qualities in the ways how we look at certain things. And also how certain images could be constituted along such principles. And obviously this poster for one of those early 50s spectacles combining 3D and Technicolor, another novelty at the time, makes a very pretty clear, straightforward, tangible connection by that indexical sign on the left, 3D pointing to a certain part of somebody's body. Or it could be about these things. We don't particularly like the idea about being bitten by a Rottweiler or a pit bull, but if this happens on a 3D spectacle, so might be more acceptable. Well, of course, this is not the whole story, and that is not exactly the story that I'm going to talk about tonight. So it's a kind of a background story for other kinds of explorations of stereoscopic 3D. So I'm interested in looking at the way how artists have taken that technology, let's say during about 100 years, and trying to sort of like speculate a little bit about those motivations as well behind those ideas. Because it often seems that there are artists who, while they perfectly master that technology, they seem to be interested in kind of distorting and even inverting that technology. So to understand why some of those motives, ideas behind that kind of work, I think we have to have a quick peek at the origins and the early history of stereography. And that takes us back to the year 1838. That was the year when an eminent British scientist announced the discovery of stereoscopic vision and representation and demonstrated that for his colleagues in England. And that happened within the context of a new field, which was often known as the physiology of perception. So he basically had a device with which he wanted to demonstrate that there's a kind of a discrepancy between the outer world and the image, so the image that we form of that reality in our minds. So basically saying that it involves something a kind of a creative act. So it doesn't happen automatically. There's something that performs a kind of a distortion or change or transformation in between. And that person was Charles Wheatstone, who was also known for many other inventions, including his contributions to the history of the telegraph, electric telegraph, and other things. And so the thing that you see here behind Charles Wheatstone is the original stereoscope. And the structure of the original stereoscope is pretty interesting because it tells us everything about the motivation behind that device. So in this device, which is actually the original one kept at the Science Museum in London, so you see that the sort of like prism in the middle is as a mirror, two mirrors, and the two pictures taken from a slightly different angle are placed on left and right. So what you're supposed to do is to look at that prism in the middle, and when that happens in the correct way, from a correct perspective, so you get an illusion of three-dimensional space. Now the interesting thing here, I think, is the open structure of that device. So it was definitely not meant to support any kind of a visual illusion or special effect. It was strictly a scientific device, made for scientific demonstration of a newly discovered principle. Of course, everything in life is much more complex than you say in a lecture or in every sentence. So there is a certain kind of prehistory of trying to look at these things as well, much earlier. Even Leonardo da Vinci could be linked with that, but I'm going to bypass that idea. It's kind of like a side path right here. But anyway, so obviously what happened here was something different from the tradition of imaging that was known since the Renaissance times. So where the basic idea was to look at three-dimensional spaces in reality and find ways of certain kind of mathematical transformation rules to translate those 3D spaces into two-dimensional surfaces, as we see from very well from these famous diagrams by Albrecht Dürer. So the art was really so like taking something 3D and turning it into 2D that really evolved somehow through those perspectival rules, that kind of a world of 3D. And now, what I found pretty interesting the other day, I was going through some books in a second-hand bookstore, and I found this artistically probably not so successful publication called Art Masterpieces in 3D. 40 images by Vermeer, Rembrandt, Goya, and other great artists. Thank God it was only $5. So what you have is a book with a lenticular 3D viewer, and then basically a sort of like run through some of the masterpieces of the history of nothing but perspectival art, translated into these familiar-looking 3D pictures, which obviously turns the whole history of art into something completely different, because it basically reverses the complete trajectory of the Renaissance, sort of like Renaissance perspective of thinking, producing a pretty cheesy series of images that out of something that were not supposed to be anything like you see in this book. So this device tried to do something else, produce a very different kind of a representation, of course a binocular representation. It is also really important to keep in mind that so people often identify stereoscopy and photography, which is a mistake, because stereoscopy was demonstrated before photography was made public, and it was demonstrated by drawings like this. This is a very rare early stereo card from my collection, 1852, by the famous optical instrument maker Jules Dupos from Paris. There's a very complex, long series of drawn stereo card he put out at an early moment that we will see soon. Beautiful scientific and sort of like optical research reasons. What is interesting, of course, is that the stereoscopy actually started going very soon to another direction. And that is directly reflected in the construction of the apparatus, which actually became the breakthrough, which was the so-called Brewster stereoscope, which was introduced publicly at the Crystal Palace exhibition in 1851, so the first World's Fair. So Queen Victoria and Prince Albert probably got fascinated, and so did many others. And so this led to this huge so-called stereoscopomania in a matter of months and a number of years. So when ending up like hundreds of thousands of different viewers, millions of stereo cards being sold. Obviously the trick here is that the picture is hidden inside the device, and when you hold it in front of your eyes, so it has nothing of that open structure of the original Wheatstone viewer. So the original stereoscopic photographs that became the main form of stereoscopic imagery were shot with either type of these two cameras. Either a camera which could be was placed on a slide and sort of like moved from side to side, approximating the parallax difference of the humans, or a camera with two lens systems, as you probably all know. And it is interesting to speculate whether this stereoscopomania would ever have taken place if the original structural, sort of like reflecting mirror stereoscope would have been the device that was actually put to the shelves of shops. We of course don't really know, but we think that the idea that the structure of that device was more so like immersive, enclosed, played an important role. It may not have been the cause, as I actually agree, but it was an important contributing factor. It is, however, interesting that the stereoscope that probably led to the real mass market was somewhat different in its structure. It was the so-called Holmes Bates viewer, which you see on the right, and this is the prototype which you see in the middle, which was designed by famous medical doctor Oliver Wendell Holmes in the United States. And that device, we could say, in a way, is a kind of a compromise between these two forms, in the sense that it has this immersive viewing hood, but at the same time the picture is basically open, placed on a focusing slide that goes, as I'm sure all of you know, these very, very common devices. So whether the structure was purely sort of like motivated by being much cheaper to make than those enclosed wooden, beautiful mahogany viewers, or whether it has some features that sort of like made it more attractive to people by giving them a chance to sort of like switch between the stereo card, which shows the left and right hand views, and then the synthesis through the lenses and the viewing hood is always open for debate. But what definitely happened is that on the mainstream of stereoscopy became parlor entertainment. So this is I would say, a really wonderful stereo card, also for my collection. I have actually a fairly large collection of that stuff. Unfortunately, too large. My university office is absolutely stuffed. I used to have like TA meetings there, but I have to take the TAs to the cafe these days. Not to say anything about my home, which is an even sadder story. Anyway, it's easy to call it stereo cards because unless you have terribly many, so they don't have that much time. So like huge peep show machines, of the 18th century, I have a few. So in this particular one, which I like particularly much because it shows piano playing as a typical parlor entertainment in the Victorian parlor, children playing, and at the back, people sitting around the table and actually viewing stereoscopic card with a Brewster mirror right there. If you have the skill of free viewing, you can actually see it in 3D if you know how to twist your eyes. So that is possible. It's a pretty sharp one. But basically it's a beautiful, so they did a lot of self-promotion with these cards, and so like trying to place those devices inside the cards. So like I think work on that desire to have one and keep on collecting these things, and so that's also a pretty widespread phenomenon. Okay, and so there's a perfect link with the sort of like 20th century promotions around the realist system or the viewmaster, the popular thing for decades. There's of course also the other aspect, which is this pornography. I could have chosen a much cheesier thing, something that I really would have asked you to close your eyes in the manner of Duchamp's étant donné, but photographic. But I decided to be nice. and the kind of conservative. So anyway. There's also the other side, which is actually often forgotten or neglected. The fact that stereoscopy, side by side with those sort of like immersive parlor entertainments, served all kinds of experimentation and other purposes. And this card from 1861 shows you one interesting application. This is basically supposed to be a very simple animation, which sort of like switches between the idea about animation and three-dimensional immersion. Where you see that basically the position of the camera here is the same for the left and right eye views, and so basically the background and the surroundings produces a normal three-dimensional stereoscopic 3D space. But you also see that the person actually moves that rake in different positions. So the idea is that if you want to see the card as a three-dimensional spatial illusion, you just look at the surroundings. If you want to see it in motion, you start kind of like blinking your eyes in rapid succession. Left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right. And so you get actually a simple animation. And such ideas were quickly picked up by medical doctors and turned into programs for eye training or brain training or whatever kind of devices, as we will see in a moment. There's also the really interesting aspect, which is military applications. So most people don't know probably that Viewmaster, which was invented in 1939 in the United States, and using the newly introduced film stock of 16mm Kodachrome film as the material support for those pictures on those Viewmaster reels, has survived because it was picked up by the United States Army, Navy, and Air Force as a training device during the Second World War. So large numbers of highly methodologically produced reels were produced. So for studying, which basically means identification of different types of airplanes and boats and whatever, but also for target practice. So showing airplanes in different positions with a certain kind of like a hand-drawn series of layers, supposedly helping the gunners in bomber planes or fighter pilots to sort of like learn estimation of the distance to the enemy planes. And if we then look at this card, we understand one more link to the medical aspect of stereoscopy. So this is the so-called stereofusion card. I don't know if you know these things, but this is based on the principle of so-called retinal rivalry. But the idea is basically that using dissimilar images as the left and right eye using stereoscopes, and then sort of like developing this kind of progressive viewing tactics, you can actually create animations, and you can actually sort of like supposedly test your eyes. And if these were motivated well enough, you could actually see in a way that bird with the ring, which is kind of a surreal. So in this case, to sort of like fly to the cage as you twist your eyes. And if you keep on twisting your eyes, so it produces another like little animation type situation. So here, rather than on the three-dimensional illusion, the emphasis is on the idea of motion. But we will see how this idea about 3D and motion go often hand in hand when we look at the ways how artists started dealing with these things. But if we look at a classical example of a surrealist painting by René Magritte, a painting called Ciel, Sky, from 1929, we get an idea of his motivation. Because this painting is supposed to be viewed by those principles of medical imaging that were actually fairly widespread and known, and that fascinated the surrealists in that sense. So basically, when you see this exhibition in an exhibition, you are not supposed to sort of like bring your stereo viewer with you or whatever. It is based on the idea about certain kind of free viewing skills that people have developed, possibly by trying those medical applications like we saw before, the Dr. Wells's card set, or by knowing about that idea. So knowing that once you see these things side by side, you're supposed to start twitching your eyes in a funny way until that word ciel moves in the middle of that sky. And then we get to the sort of like more typical, this is not a pipe type of Magritte illusions. But here Magritte takes his inspiration from stereoscopic imaging and from a particular form of stereoscopic 3D. Okay, so the artist whom I already mentioned, Marcel Duchamp, may well be the artist who's actually applied stereoscopy in the most, shall we say, most complex and sometimes in an interestingly hidden ways in his production. And if you know about Marcel Duchamp's work, Duchamp is known for posing his own persona in the center of much of his work. So, which means he played this kind of a role-playing games, most famous being his female alter ego called Rose de la Vie. So he used to sign a lot of work by Rose de la Vie, posed as in drag in photographs taken by Man Ray and so on. But it is less well known that he had another alter ego that he played with for many, many years. And this artistic role-play character was the precision oculist, which was some kind of a simulated optical scientist or optician. And he indicated this in many ways. One of the ways was that he bought this eye doctor's chart you see on the right and sent it to Walter Arensberg, who was the most famous collector of Duchamp's works. We also see many other examples. Now, I want to return very briefly to this piece, this early stereoscopic slide that I already showed you from Duchamp's career. And now, if we look at this first, and then I'll show you test cards from one of those medical books about stereoscopy from 1892 by this German author, Dr. Georg Hirt, Das plastische Sehen. So we probably start seeing certain kind of links and connections. For in that set of cards that comes with this book, we find basically both motives that Duchamp represented in that early work. However, Duchamp's interest was somewhere else. So this was the time when he had left painting and was developing this idea about the ready-mades, often seen as one of the most radical innovations. So picking up everyday objects and sometimes modifying them and giving them new meanings, new names, and treating them as artworks. So the story behind this particular thing goes that he actually found this really poorly realized stereoscopic commercial stereo photo from a flea market or street market in Buenos Aires. And he obviously was fascinated by the fact that here we have a stereoscopic card that produces hardly any 3D effect, because it is a stereo card of open sea with very few depth cubes in that particular scene. So he was fascinated by the paradox that we have here a stereoscopic 3D picture that practically produces only 2D illusion. So the kind of the Dadaists, surrealists, so Dadaist surrealists, those artist group that Duchamp was close to, were very fascinated by, often by failure and mistake and pure chance and that kind of ideas. So what he did, he then hand drew on the card kind of a rhomboid form, exactly like you would see from this tradition of stereoscopic drawings that goes back to all the way to Charles Wheatstone and Dubosc, as I showed you before, which is it's an important part of this rational, scientific line of thinking about stereoscopy. And so he combined those elements. So the three-dimensional element came through his own action, which here his intervention, which is not really original, was not meant to be original, because the idea of the ready-made was really about like this kind of coolness, and so he tried to sort of like produce objects that are without emotions, which are distant and kind of indifferent in a certain way. So here he combines two forms of indifference. First of all, failed stereo card, and then this kind of like a stereotypical scientific 3D drawing that you could find from many things for many decades before that. Okay. He produced many works that in the early periods of his career, which in one way or another raised 3D and linked that with a certain paradoxes. Often this sort of like relation sit between 2D imaging, looking at and looking through. For example, this early piece, which has this wonderful, it's like a quasi-didactic title, to be looked at from the other side of the glass with one eye closed to for almost an hour. Where basically he defines it as a like a one-eye piece, not like a binocular piece, but at its certain viewing lenses and actually etched three-dimensional shapes on the glass, which, depending on the angle, give a sort of like pseudo-stereoscopic effect in this particular case. This is one of his also famous ready-mades, which is a ready-made poster for wanted poster, where he actually replaced the criminal's face with his own portrait. And it actually took until a couple of years ago before one art historian discovered the stereoscopic secret behind this thing. So it's really interesting how Duchamp played with these kind of riddles that were hidden in layers. And they were very consciously made, and there are obviously many such paradoxes and sort of like enigmas yet to be discovered. What I think is interesting to look, so now look at the way how he framed these portraits. And so what this art historian noticed is that when you just focus on these pictures and then you perform this auto-stereographic act with your like free viewing act, or you make a stereo slide and put it in a stereoscope. So these pictures, frames produce a three-dimensional frame, and the left and right portraits merge with each other. So producing a certain kind of visual paradox where Duchamp is simultaneously staring ahead and to the side. So a composite head picture. And he actually gave a hint in this book cover he designed for the reading of that ready-made. But it took this many years after his death for anybody to discover that link and connection. So this work was non-stereoscopic hint for reading that early ready-made as a stereoscopic, hidden stereoscopic slide. And this is the way how Duchamp's work constantly dives back into stereoscopic 3D. Now, his other interest was actually taking this idea of three-dimensionality and linking that with motion. A topic that we encounter all across this sort of like also way from the physiological optical research represented by Wheatstone and others, as I will show you in a moment. And in this sense, these works that he saw as the works of the precision oculist, he's one of his alter egos, like rotary demisphere, which is this piece that's a motor-operated optical illusion machine. His film, Anemic Cinema. So Anemic Cinema is a failed anagram. So if you read it from the back, it forms Amenik Simena. And he want this kind of failure to come up with something perfect. And perfection is in the failure. And then the famous set of optical discs called rotoreliefs. And here his interest was actually looking at the ways how motion can replace the need for binocular stereopsis, so to say. So motion can take certain features and elements of this binocular view and produce a three-dimensional image. This music is added later, so Duchamp would have turned in his grave. So, yeah. So this is basically the principle, and in his typical way, he in this film Anemic Cinema, he juxtaposes with these mystery wordplay discs that are definitely 2D, and without naturally explaining the relationship between. So there's an alternation between these sometimes extremely three-dimensional big discs that actually raised some scientific interest at the time. And I think that there's still an idea that Duchamp was the first to invent this principle of one eye, so monocular three-dimensional imaging by means of use of motion as an element. So these discs, by the way, I think he loved using this kind of puns. I think they were inspired by Raymond Roussell's amazing novels like Locus Solus and Trip to Africa that Duchamp admired, and many of the surrealists. But basically, this is how the principle works. So the rotoreliefs, and so this is probably something that would go far too much in detail, but let me just show that. So these kind of efforts of combining stereoscopic 3D and motion actually had a long history. And we have nearly forgotten devices like Jules de Bosque's bioscope, which I can explain you in detail if anybody wants. But so this is like a so-called phenakistoscope animation disc, and you're supposed to watch it from the other side, so through those holes and slots. This is the typical phenakistoscope principle. Now, the left and right eye views here have been arranged so that I think the left eye views are around the perimeter of the disc, and the right eye views closer to the center. And it doesn't seem to make any sense at all. So how can you possibly sort of like align these ideas and get a three-dimensional picture in motion? So his solution are those two little mirrors you see in front of those. So the mirrors are in a different angle. Sort of like, so you are basically supposed to look at this from the other side, so from the mirrors, and because the mirrors are not sort of like in the same angle, so it aligns those pictures and produces a stereoscopic picture, stereoscopic 3D in motion. This is a very rare device. Only one of those discs survives, and we have this replica that was made some years ago to demonstrate that it was actually functional. Or we have devices like stereoscopic praxinoscope, which is kind of a very strange device. Using this device, putting the other way, facing each other, and adding a stereoscopic view piece, so you could basically have something like that. So we have a sort of like a amazing history. And I think what's really interesting in Duchamp's case is this like highly ironic and complex way of playing with these ideas like 2D, 3D, and what he called 4D. So basically taking the motion as an added element, and that thing happens all the time. But we have others, and it's really interesting that we discover major figures who are pretty much forgotten. And this person, Alphonse Schilling, I don't know how many of you knows about the work of Alphonse Schilling. I can guess, but Alphonse Schilling, I'll tell you, is a major artist on this field, and it is a great, crazy situation to have him forgotten. So I'll show you a little bit about the work of Alphonse Schilling. He was mostly active in New York during his most important period in the 60s and 70s. He was from Switzerland originally and also active in Europe. So let's have a quick look at Alphonse Schilling's work and with stereoscopy. And I hope that you'll be convinced that this is a major artist to be discovered. This is not stereo. This is what he did in the early part of his career. So he was influenced by tree painting, so action painting, Jackson Pollock, like so many others. And he came up with this idea. He was the first, not Damon Hirst. Damon Hirst, who's reinvented this thing right now. He did it for years in the beginning of the 60s. So he had these motorized canvases on which he used to paint. So this idea about movement comes here. He produced a large series of really amazing looking things. This is actually the same painting but seen in different positions. You see here, he called these paintings dispersions. And this is a series of pictures which shows that how much more radical he was than Damien Hirst. Because Hirst only uses it as a production device. But his idea is that these things could be shown either static or in motion in exhibitions. So rotating paintings at different speeds in exhibitions, or they could be shown as static. He was one of the very first people to come up with the principle of the autostereogram that became a fashion in the beginning of the 90s with these magic eye books and that kind of stuff. But he already painted these deep autostereographic paintings in the early 70s. This is the first known example. Actually, with the same principle as looking at those magic eye books, you can actually see it in deep 3D, that painting. He also produced large random dot stereogram paintings already in the early 70s. The same way, in this case, you're supposed to sort of like twist your eyes and make them match each other, and you see the three-dimensional quality of these things. So 20 years before these things became sort of like commercially marketed and widely known, he designed early stereoscopic video goggles with systems like this, combining a very, very kind of early video cameras with, you see the built, so the screens are separated here, but these were connected to like a head-mounted display-like system that he used for stereoscopic imaging. This happened alongside pretty much of the early head-mounted display research from Sutherland and then the other Vickers and others in the early 70s. He also created complex systems of public stereographic projections. So he made these performances with slide projectors and came up with these rotary shutter blades, different designs, and manages to get this kind of very plastically molding strange 3D pictures that would be moving and changing in front of your eyes. And he basically wanted to patent this idea that was known as shilling effect. This is his letter for the US patent authorities, and a detailed description of how this motion actually produces a three-dimensional, so like additional three-dimensional effects in motion. This is a diagram that I found, and I found really interesting, where he basically summarizes his research, saying to see with two eyes is equal to motion, spatial noise equals thickness of plane. So where basically he says that that motion principle that he was developing produces this kind of synthesis. Now, what is interesting is that we have a history of rotary discs used for 3D, but in a more simple way. Like in this system, Teleview in the 1920s, which was used in some movie theaters, the viewers would be viewing the cinema by this kind of devices that they attach to every seat. And inside this device, you have a rotary shutter that basically clocks, alternating with black and white moving images there. So it was probably a pretty clumsy system, so it didn't really work. But it is, so it didn't create a tradition. But it is an early example of trying to sort of like replace this kind of anaglyphic, so like red-green filter system with something like alternating black and white images. And in that sense, it points out to certain kind of later shutter glass technology in this kind of public stereo. Also interesting is that you may know about Ken Jacobs, who has been performing a lot of with these systems called the nerve system and nervous magic lantern. Either films with two projectors and these rotating shutters, or slides. And what Ken Jacobs these days, and let's take it as a little critique, what he these days forgets to mention every time is that he took the idea from Alfons Schilling. And he was actually early on, he admitted that. I have early writings by him where he admits that I was inspired by Alfons Schilling and his Schilling effect. So that system that is now attributed to Ken Jacobs exclusively is originally Alfons Schilling's method. Schilling is forgotten, but Ken Jacobs is remembered. So this is, but of course Ken has done additional effects. Finally, Schilling produced most amazing system in the 1980s called Machines for Seeing, or Z-Machine, which were basically this kind of crazy looking artistic machines for testing alternate vision. So he used to walk with these machines in all kinds of landscapes. He has a whole variety of systems. And these were meant to be sort of like extend your parallax view by means of prisms and mirrors and lenses. And so once you try them either in the cityscape or in the countryside, so it is really about sort of changing the way how that sort of like impression of realities is sort of like imprinted on your brain. So it is something that where a radical artist is linking with the tradition of Wheatstone and those others completely. This is one of my favorites, Light Pump or Phantom Brain, which takes that shutter idea, producing this kind of crazy machine helmet, which obviously completely changes what you see. This is his walking camera obscura. Camera obscura hut. And then he also had these static systems where he basically installed viewing devices, huge mirrors and prisms to sort of like extend the parallax even more. So basically you could get amazing sort of like alternate visions of landscapes by looking at the way how the reflected scenes from the landscape are transferred to your eyes through that system, which I find extremely interesting in many ways. And he's very little known these days, actually. And but luckily, a few years ago, he's still alive. And so luckily, a few years ago, the MAK, the Museum der Angewandten Kunst, the Museum of Applied Art in Vienna, actually bought that whole series of machines. So they are preserved, and they are now kept in their collection, which with quite a lot of his other stuff as well.